Hello, everybody. Can you all hear me? All right, good afternoon, everyone. I apologize for being a few minutes late. I thought we were starting at 3:30, not 3:15. That was my bad. So thank you so much for coming. We are on panel 3A. This is Black Monstrosity. My name is Cecilia Abate. I'll be your moderator for today. I want to give a big thank you to UCSC for having me back again to moderate. I really appreciate it. And we have 3 illustrious panelists here with us today. So the first person you're going to be hearing from, is going to be Edmund Ankomah from Ashesi University in Ghana. And he has Theorizing Xenocorporality and Monstrous Effect in African Speculative Fictions. Dr. Edmund Ankomah earned his BA and Master of Philosophy degrees in English Literature from the University of Ghana. He recently earned his PhD at Illinois State University. His dissertation, Fabulating the Alien, Black Speculative Fiction and a Rereading of the Xenological Archive, explores extraterrestriality and the politics that attend it in Afrofuturism and African futurism. Ankomah currently serves as the instructional assistant professor at Illinois State University. Thank you so much for being here. And our second speaker here today is going to be Jalondra A. Davis, University of California, Riverside. So we've got The Monster in the Water, Tananarive Dew's The Lake in print and film. Dr. Jalondra A. Davis, an assistant professor at University of California, Riverside, is a Black feminist artist and intellectual working at the intersections of Black studies, women and gender studies, and contemporary genre fictions and popular culture. She has been published in the Journal of the Fantastic in the Arts, Shima Journal, the Museum of Science Fiction Journal of Science Fiction, and in the Routledge Anthology of Confucianisms. Her monograph in progress, Merfolk and Being Black in the Water, is about Black mermaids. She is the author of a novel, Butterfly Jar, and talks mermaids on the Merwomanist podcast, which sounds so fun and amazing. I'm absolutely getting into that. And our third speaker here today is DeAnna Daniels from the University of Arizona. We have Monstrous Reclamation, Exploring Black Religion Through the Monstrous. DeAnna Monique Daniels is an assistant professor of Africana and Religious Studies at the University of Arizona. She has a PhD in religion from the African American Religion Concentration from Rice University. DeAnna's scholarly interests are diverse, focusing on Black religion, the intersections of gender and sexuality, Black speculative fiction and horror, popular and visual culture, and art and aesthetics. Her research engages critical theory, disability theory, Black studies, and cultural studies. So to begin here today, we're going to let Edmund take the lead. You've got about 20 minutes to speak. I'll kind of give you a little wave, and we've got about a few more left.
Okay, thank you. Okay, can you hear me? All right, wonderful. I'm happy to be here. I will try to give this as much of a structure as I can. The slides are supposed to give some kind of rhetorical visual back into some of the arguments that I'll be making. So in the novel Lagoon, I don't know how many of you have read Lagoon, African futurist author Nnedi Okorafor contemplates the sort of special interaction between human and alien that would ensue if aliens were to arrive in the populous and multi-embodied city space that is Lagos. Now in Lagoon, the aliens that arrive in Lagos's waters not only decontaminate the water of petrochemical toxins, but they also transform marine life such that we have a kaiju-like swordfish and alien-enhanced cephalopods with, quote, horrible black bony spokes and parrot-like beaks. The narrator reminds readers that there is more to this city than you imagined, and that, quote, there are other things inhabiting Lagos besides carbon-based creatures. There are greater beings of the earth, soil, sea, lagoon, and land, end quote, And so this talk is kind of based on my dissertation, and I particularly look at aliens from two distinct perspectives: from an African American science fictional perspective, which is Afrofuturism, and from an African speculative fictions perspective. Now, my idea of extraterrestriality does not only suggest the science fictional category of the alien. I am looking at terrestriality as it encodes non-human beings. So we are looking at some kind of interconnection between material and metaphysical bodies, because in the African speculative fictions, the metaphysical is always already in contact with the material, right? So this is how I'm thinking about extraterrestriality. I'm sure you've seen, some of you have seen some of these movies. I'm showing this image because what you'd find in these movies is we have the archetype of the alien as external aggressor, right? The alien who has come to kill, destroy, and humans as the hapless victims of the alien's conquest. All right, so what I'm arguing is that in African speculative fictions, particularly in Nnedi Okorafor's imagining of the alien, there is a nuance to the alien that is depicted, right? The alien is not just this insatiable destroyer. There's no point to what he's doing. In Nnedi Okorafor's imagining of the alien, these aliens are kind of ambivalent. There's a kind of ambivalent reading of the alien that is imagined. So my particular preoccupation here is to offer a reading of the monster in African speculative fiction, especially in the ways in which it coincides with the figure and trope of the extraterrestrial. Now, let me say that part of what I am discussing here today is informed by work I did for my dissertation, where I theorized a way of interpreting alienness, the alien body and alien space in dialogue with the racialized Black body. So part of what I interrogate in my dissertation is how tropes of alienness in popular science fiction, such as Karen Menzies' 1953 Invaders from Mars, Toby Hooper's 1968 version of the same name, Kaufman's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Emmerich's Independence Day, Cameron's Avatar, Ridley Scott's Alien, how these become manifest in Afrofuturist texts such as Delaney's Blake, Jordan Peele's Get Out, and Derek Bell's The Space Traders. And so one of the things that I argue in Get Out is that Chris Washington, played by Daniel Kaluuya, is a kind of alien body in the Armitage residence. And so the Armitage residence is kind of framed as an alien space. And so with all of the perils of, what happens in an alien space, right? And so it is, so one of the things that I argue is that the popular trope of the sunken place where we see, Chris kind of falling in this kind of somatic psychical suspension is a kind of, falling into a black void, kind of falling into black space, that kind of helplessness of falling into space. And so that is essentially what I mean by a xenological reading. I am superimposing tropes of extraterrestriality in reading African-American science fiction and also African science fiction. So this image kind of relates to that. I will not be if there's a question on this, I will talk about this. But I want to very quickly move on to African speculative fiction. One of the theorists that I draw on is Asa Mittman, who may or may not be here. And one of the arguments that Asa Mittman makes is that our response to the alien is realized in the sense that the monster is, so I'm thinking about the alien as monster trope, right? And Asa Mittman argues that the monster is something that shouldn't be, but is. And there's a quote here that I'm very quickly going to read. The monster is that which unsettles or challenges established cognitive categories and interpretive strategies. Above all, the monstrous is that which creates a sense of vertigo, that which calls into question there anyone's epistemological worldview, highlights its fragmentary and inadequate nature, and thereby asks us to acknowledge the failures of our systems of categorization. Now, I'm alluding to this quote because one of the things that I'm arguing here is that the alien as monster trope, the kind that we have it in more mainstream Western science fiction, doesn't quite fit in with how the monster is imagined in African speculative fiction, right? So affect, the way we respond to the alien or the way we respond to the monster is conditioned by, cultural context. And so I'm drawing on Yoruba and Igbo cosmology that essentially says that our material world is already in contact with the metaphysical, right? So the idea of a threatening non-human figure does not necessarily elicit the kind of response or rouse the kind of what Freud calls the uncanny, right? The kind of excitation of dread or fear. So yes, we might have beings that are non-human beings that may look threatening, but then they do not elicit the same kind of response. So that is part of what I'm arguing. And I'm saying this in the context of what I call, a theory that is called an animist consciousness, which is popular, right? This idea of animist consciousness, the idea that, the world that we live in, there's a kind of traffic between the material and the metaphysical that is already in African speculative fiction. All right, so I'm just going to skip all of this. Now, in Carpenter's The Thing, I don't know how many of you have seen Carpenter's The Thing. We have this weird, alien monster creature that is an assemblage of different body parts. Now, we have a similar example in Dio Fagunwa's and Amos Tutuola. So this is Dio Fagunwa and Amos Tutuola in African speculative fiction. And now they are writing in the 1930s and the 1940s, and they are imagining a creature that is kind of like John Carpenter's The Thing, that is an assemblage of different body parts. And I'm just going to read, Amos Tutuola's reading of The Thing, his own African version of the things. I don't know why this keeps skipping. All right. So when he reached where he left the foot, he pulled it out, he gave it to the owner and paid him. When they reached the place where he hired the right foot, he pulled it out and gave it to the owner and paid for the rentage. Now both feet had returned to the owners, so he began to crawl along the ground, and by that time, the lady wanted to go back to her town or her father, but a terrible and curious creature or the complete gentleman did not allow her to return. Now, this complete gentleman was reduced to head. So we have this creature that basically gives out body parts, right? Kind of like John Carpenter's The Thing, who is basically an assemblage of just different multi-special body parts. I argue that the kind of cellular corporeal dismantling and reconstitution we observe with Carpenter's predatory alien is here observed in similar unsettling manner, right? So Tutuola's complete gentleman is rather ironically an incomplete hybridization or fusion of several rented body parts, just like Carpenter's The Thing. All right, so this is the quote that I just shared. So one of the things that I'm arguing is that, this idea of the liminality of the alien body, the alien body as not just one thing, as a kind of limit case. I think Cohen's monster thesis 3 and monster thesis 4 kind of draws on that. The monster dwells at the gates of difference. The monster challenges established categories that we have. So I draw on that in my reading of African speculative fiction and how that is imagined. I want to very quickly, so this is from John Carpenter's The Thing, and what I just read to you is from, Amos Tutuola's 1930s, 1940s text, which is a similar thing, right? So the spiritual world of African peoples is very densely populated with spiritual beings, spirits, and the living dead. To understand their religious ethos and philosophical perception, it is essential to consider their concepts of the spiritual world in addition to concepts of God. And so one of the figures that we find in Nnedi Okorafor's Lagoon is the road monster. And I tried to get an image that represents the road monster from the internet. Now, essentially, this is a kind of organic. It's like kind of organic a fusion between the organic and the non-organic, right? And it's in the text. This is a monster that devours locals, the Nigerian locals. So when aliens arrive in Lagos, when aliens arrive in Nigeria, these aliens are shape-shifting. Now, what happens when aliens arrive in Nigeria is that there are other metaphysical, magical, you might want to call them magical spirits, deities that also merge with the extraterrestrials. In Lagos, what you have is you have humans, you have spirit beings, you have aliens, right? So you have a range of non-human bodies that coexist in this new Lagos. And so one of these creatures is the road monster that devours, um, um, you know, the locals. Now, this is a quote from Inedio Crawford's Lagoon that refers to this road monster. In that moment, I understood in my gut she was not human. She was not earthly. She was something completely other. But she was not evil either. The road was undulating. Then it began to stretch like hot plastic. Something beneath it groaned, deep and cavernous. The air stank of tar, and I felt a blast of heat on my face. The road said as it began to move beneath the vehicles. My nostrils stunk from the stench. The road was rising up in a huge snake-like slab of concrete, the faded yellow stripes still in view. Then it rippled in a concrete wave. It knocked cars off itself as it rolled toward the fleeing people. When it got to them, well, you heard nothing but shrieks of agony. So there's kind of visual representation of what happens. Another character another being that you find in Lagoon is Eshu Elegbara. Eshu Elegbara is a Yoruba trickster, Orisha. It's unfortunate that Eshu Elegbara does not have much emphasis in Lagoon, but Eshu Elegbara is another important creature. Now, what happens with Eshu Elegbara in Lagoon is that Nedi does this really interesting thing where she merges Eshu Elegbara with kind of a digital kind of world. So Eshu Elegbara proceeds from a computer, right? And it's really interesting why, how Inedio Okorafor does that. But essentially, you have spirit beings. Eshu Elegbara is a spirit being. You have a spirit being that comes to life, manifests in corporeal form inside of the text. And it's really interesting what Inedio Okorafor does with that. The other being we have is Ijele, or the chief masquerade, also from Igbo mythology. Now, the local lore is that if you see Ijele, you die. Well, essentially, you're not supposed to survive upon seeing Ijele. So there's the idea of the monstrous in there. But in Inedio Okorafor's Lagoon, there's a scene where one of the characters meets Ijele, and this is Ijele who's like 30 feet high, in corporeal form, but then, nothing kind of happens to Ijele. Is non-threatening. Ijele is presented as the kind of non-threatening being. And so one of the things that Inedio Okorafor is arguing, or at least is subverting, is this idea of the extraterrestrial as being always connected to the monstrous or something that is threatening. That there's a different way to look at the non-human than just the default archetype of aggressor or killer. So Ijele is threatening, but in the novel Lagoon, Ijele is not presented in much the same way. And this is just a quote that kind of gives you an idea of what it is that I'm referring to. There's another being in Inedio Okorafor's Lagoon who, kind of in the typical fashion of aliens in popular sci-fi, they shapeshift, right? So this is a woman. Well, the title given to, or the name given to this woman is the woman who is not woman. This is a similar creature that we find in Amos Tutuola's The Palm Wine Drinkard as well, like I just shared. So this is a woman who is able to morph into any creature, right? I don't know how many of you have read Animorphs. Yeah, okay, all right. So morph. So there's a kind of borrowing that is happening here, but Inedio Okorafor, in typical African futurist fashion, is situating these popular tropes of mutants, alien beings, the non-human. She's situating them within the context of an African space, and is given a kind of regional context to these different beings. All right. So let me just very quickly. Okay, all right. So what I'm trying to argue here is that in Eddie Okorafor's lagoon, and this is not just in Eddie Okorafor's lagoon, there is three Davis Okungbo's David Mogo, the God Hunter, as well, where essentially you have kind of like it draws on. I think it draws on. A bit of Norse mythology, a bit of Greek mythology as well. So we have, deities that essentially arrive in Lagos, and they interact with the people, and they are non-threatening, right? Obviously, we have, when you see them, they look threatening, but they are not kind of default aggressors, right? They are not kind of default aggressors. And so Inedu Okorafor is asking us to kind of rethink our imagining of the alien. There's a creature that I didn't talk about because I did not have much time, but let me just show the Mami Water. Mami Water is the idea of the mermaid. Mami Water worshipped in parts of West and Central Africa. Actually, among the Ewe are a group that I know very well in Ghana. Among the Ewe, Mami Water is not exactly a malevolent creature, right? But in popular depictions of Mami Water, there's this idea that Mami Water is evil, and Mami Water. So this is a half human, half fish, kind of hybrid, and this is also a being that we find in Inedi Okorafor's lagoon. So what I'm arguing essentially is that in Inedi Okorafor's lagoon, we have a kind of convivial rendering of multi-special creatures who are living in harmony. And what happens at the end of the novel is that there's an essence of alienness that kind of diffuses into the air, and everyone in Nigeria or everyone in Lagos becomes hybrid, becomes alien in some kind of ways. And that is how the novel ends. But it's very different from, Independence Day, Roland Emmerich's Independence Day, where the idea is that the aliens have to go there. We have to kill the aliens. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's good. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. Love that. Love that so much. Okay, so I am Jalondra A. Davis. I work as an assistant professor at UC Riverside. My larger book project is Merfolk and Black Being in Water, but this is actually something I'm planning to be an article that is outside of that project. Little content warning, certainly no graphic depictions or images, but there will be references to grooming, sexual violence against a minor, and child harm. So this presentation is excerpts of very early draft of an article that I am working on about Tananarive Dew's short story, The Lake, as well as the film version directed by Sandashi Brown and adapted for screen by Dew and her husband, Stephen Barnes. Whereas the original story was, I'm just going to say in a more white feeling setting, with a more kind of like a racially ambiguous protagonist, the film version places it in a distinctly Black communal context, at the same time as it visualizes the ambiguous Lake Munster of the original story as a siren, or possibly a Mami Wata, but I'll talk about that later. This article will eventually explore the politics of this adaptation and the questions that it invokes about visual culture, what it means to theorize a racialized genre, and the representation of intra-racial violence, and what are the conditions for Black people to be able to perform the Munster. So, The Lake in both iterations is the story of a multiracial or just light-skinned Black woman named Abby LaFleur, in the different versions a little different, who purchases a large ramshackle home on the shore of a lake rumored by the people of this Florida town called Graceville to harbor mysterious forces, creatures, and powers. Running from a failed marriage and an initially undisclosed scandal of some kind, Abby appears to be trying to rebuild both her life and her fixer-upper home when she gets a job as a teacher at a local high school and recruits a teenage student to perform repairs. So we see images of her wedding picture and a picture of her with her teenage student. Despite warnings to stay away from the lake water, which is particularly dangerous in the summer, Abby begins to swim there nightly. Subverting the usual haunted house trope in which a newcomer, often attempting to make a new start, is terrorized by a threat within their new home, it is slowly revealed that the threat is not in the home, but in the water, and that the water's danger is its transformative ability to bring out, to literalize, the predator that is Abby herself. So, spoiler alert, by the end of the story, the power of the lake has transformed Abby into a monstrous creature who ravenously feeds upon young boys that it is strongly suggested she sexually preyed on in her human life. So, The Lake was first published in an anthology, a 2011 anthology called Monsters Corner, edited by Christopher Golden. The aim of this collection was to premiere a group of original horror stories written from the monster's point of view. Prioritizing this conceit, this collection does not, at least in my initial sort of skimming of it, does not seem to prioritize diversity. I have remaining research to do about this collection. I want to know more about the selection process, the other stories, but the fact that every single author mentioned in the marketing synopsis on the publisher's website appears to be white from a Google, and Tananarive, who by 2011 was certainly a very well-established horror writer with many well-received novels published, doesn't even make this little teaser list. Like, she's not one of the authors that's named. Allows me to at least hypothesize about the overriding whiteness of the collection and its imagined target audience. I point this out not so much as a critique, though it is, but as a contextualization for the strategies of subtlety and even racelessness that Black writers publishing in sort of racialized white genre institutions might deploy. Tananarive Dew's anthologizes this story again in her short story collection, Ghost Summer. So here I have images of Tananarive Dew, of the cover of Monsters Corner, and of the cover of Ghost Summer for image description purposes. Here, while the story is the same, it takes on a different context as part of a series of stories within Dew's own created universe, a sleepy and highly segregated southern town with a violently racialized history that is suggested to have helped produce the corruptive influence of the water. So I feel like the story, I originally read the story in Ghost Summer, it reads and feels a little bit different than it does in Monsters Corner, even though it's the same story because of what it's next to. So The Lake gets life again in horror noir. So I have the covers for the 3 horror noir projects. A 2021 film collection of Black written and directed horror shorts. The film anthology Horror Noir is the creative follow-up to the documentary Horror Noir, directed by Javier Bergen, but envisioned and co-produced by Tananarive Dew, also film writer and Black female horror archivist Ashley Blackwell, and also scholar Robin A. Means-Coleman. The documentary is an adaptation of Robin M. Means-Coleman's monograph Horror Noir, the first edition of which was published in 2011. So my tentative contention is that between its initial publication in the Monsters Corner in 2011 and its adaptation in Horror Noir in 2021, The Lake gets blacker. I am interested in how the theorization and genealogical construction of Black horror in both Coleman's monograph, but particularly the documentary that emerges from the monograph, carves a path for the work of Black horror writers that to be exhibited that does not necessarily center racial violence, but is adapted into film as something that could be more recognizably called Black horror, which Robin A. Means-Coleman gingerly and precisely distinguishes from Blacks in horror. So where Blacks in horror is just is they Black and they in horror. You know, Black horror is like a horror that really emanates from like Black people, Black collectivity, culture, worldviews, religious frameworks, etc. So more tangentially and not necessarily connected to these central concerns, I'm going to talk about it, but I got to figure out how to make it fit. I am also interested in the creature's realization as a siren, which also pulls the text into the mounting interest in and depiction of Black mermaids and sirens through the late 2010s and early 2020s, a phenomenon that I refer to in some of my other work as the Black mermaid renaissance. Here I have an image of Stephen Barnes, who is a screenwriter who helped adapt the screenplay, which I just mentioned that he's her husband because that makes me feel like the adaptation is faithful to what she wants. And Zandashe Brown, who is the director, and there's an image of the actress Leslie Ann Brandt as Abby LaFleur. So I developed the term ecology of Black horror to highlight the work that Black cultural workers, sometimes in collaboration with non-Black cultural workers, do in order to make it possible for a genre, and I have feelings about the word genre, but another time, another place, but for a genre to grow. Working against the belief sometimes that new Black genres or Black entries into genres comes out of nowhere or from one major inaugural text, such as Jordan Peele's Get Out. An ecology of horror, in this case, insists on the ecosystem between a variety of workers. Actors, thinkers, writers, independent publishers, fan communities, convention organizers, scholars, etc., who plant the seeds, fertilize and water the soil, and make it possible for a thing which has already bloomed before to bloom. So much must happen before the blooming. So I'm just kind of going to talk through some of my analysis. So one of the ways in which I suggest that this story gets more Black is Graceville. So Graceville is actually a universe that Tananarive Due repeats in a lot of her fiction. And in the short story, Graceville kind of becomes its own character. It's a sleepy Florida town known to be plagued by supernatural, unusual events, many of them emanating from whatever lies within its central lake. The town and its people consolidate into a kind of character of its own. One of the quotes about the sort of stories about the lake that Abby refuses to listen to is, "This was Graceville's typical experience with newcomers and outsiders. So Graceville had learned to keep its stories to itself." So not the townspeople learned to keep their stories to themselves, but Graceville learned to keep its story to itself. And I just feel like it takes on kind of like this racially neutral kind of personification, where in the short film, the stories of Graceville are always represented by Black people. Like Black people are the ones telling these stories over and over again. And every person that Abby interacts with pretty much is Black. So one of the things I think is like a condition for like Black horror is Black people actually meaningfully interacting with each other, right? And talking about things. And that is all throughout the short film. So the Mary Kay, who is the friend that she talks to in the short story, and I don't know if that name is ringing a bell, but I'll circle back to that at the end. But she is replaced by Imani, who is her, Abby's unambiguously Black, right, female friend who she talks to on the phone, who gives her, like, what did I call them? Sister girl empowerment pep talks. Like, you are a work of art. Like, you know, and I remember watching it for the first time, like, we don't talk to each other like that. And then I'm like, Black women definitely talk to each other like that. You know, you are wonderfully made. So, you know, she gives her this pep talk, and that marks her, like the way she talks to her marks Abby, who, you know, depending on what cultural context you're coming from, whether you read Abby as Black or not, I feel like most Black people in the US would. It claims her as like, oh, this is a Black woman. These are two Black women. The gardener, landscaper Zeke tells her about the lake. He's pictured here saying the lake brings out the worst. So it places the stories about the lake rather than just kind of like these superstitions contained to this specific place. It places it in a larger like Black vernacular tradition of like belief in, you know, spiritual forces, the metaphysical. her interaction with the principal, who in the short story I would assume to be this white headmistress, because she's like, she has a weird kind of little past, microaggressive like interaction with her, but that person's replaced by a black principal in predominantly black high school, who also kind of makes a pass at her, which is something that Abby will manipulate later in the film. And then she's teaching a class of, predominantly black students. It also, most importantly, there's the replacement of her victim in the short story, who was kind of a white passing but kind of vaguely racially coded teenager in the short story, with an unambiguous black teenage boy. And I think that the film, in moving from the genre of short story to film, the short story is, in her point of view, it's a third person limited narrator, but she's also an unreliable narrator. It's very Lolita-esque, right? Like she's, she's representing this boy in a particular way, is kind of like participating in these advances. But the film shows us that he's just like a sweet, darling baby, innocent. He just wants to, she tries to hire him to work at her house, and she's like, oh, I got this job. He wants to raise money for prom. We see that he is interacting with other people. He's not only a victim, he interacts with his girlfriend, his teammates, like other people in the text. So it like really centers his innocence. And I think the work of centering that innocence is extra important, as he is a black boy, and black boys aren't always extended like innocence and vulnerability. Another difference, which is a little off of my central argument, but another difference in the film adaptation of the story is that the creature is a siren. Some people distinguish mermaids and sirens. We can have that conversation. But, the siren is often, depicted as like the more predatory version of a mermaid. The screen was so dark, I just could not get a good shot of the creature, but we see like her hands are becoming webbed. She repeats her like sister girl empowerment pep talk in the context of her realizing she's becoming this creature, like I'm a work of art in progress, and she sings a siren song in the film. So this song is not present in the short story at all. And in the short story, it does not describe the creature, but the first time I read the story, because there's multiple references of the creature coming into contact with an alligator and like defeating it, I just had pictured something that was more animalistic, more reptilian. I wasn't picturing a mermaid. So I don't know how much of this has to do with just like the expediency. This is an indie film, clearly budget, they were working with what they had. So there's I think, expediency to being able to have a human hybrid creature where all you need is hair and makeup. But I think it's very interesting, like how when you move through mediums, it creates differences in the story because of those kind of challenges. Okay, so race, sexual violence, and Black horror. I first taught The Lake with students let me talk about the pictures for a second. So there's an image, the principal realizes something is up and he's trying to confront her, and she's like, oh yeah, let's talk about that over that coffee, right? So she sort of manipulates the pass he made at her earlier in order to like evade responsibility for her own like predation. She says, I'll let you know, see Swamp Thing. Her and Derek are talking, and he's talking about the rumors, the stories about the lake, and she references Swamp Thing. And, I just think it's an interesting kind of reversal. Like, if these kind of monsters, like the Swamp Thing, all these monsters have been often read as like stand-ins for like Black masculinity, and the way in which like Black men were accused of like assaulting white women, and these monsters were used to like reference that. So when she's the predator and we've got sweet darling baby Derek, I just think her referencing that in her interaction with him is just a reversal that I can do something with. I haven't quite figured out what I want to say about it. And then Derek saying to his girlfriend, who is like peeps Abby a mile away, like, oh, that old ass lady, you're going to work at her house, and he's like, oh, here we go, everyone's after me. And something about that was poignant, right? This Black boy, like, everyone's after me. And he's saying it with this lightness, but like, it's true. So, And then I have an image of Mary Kay Letourneau, which is the story that inspires the original story of the lake and is very heavily referenced in the original short story. Okay, so I first taught the lake with students in 2023. I was able to get my Gen Z students to recognize the grooming allegory not through the story of Mary Kay Letourneau, which they didn't know about, but through the Netflix film inspired by the story that premiered in 2023, May, December. So for anyone who doesn't know, Mary Kay Letourneau was a 34 teacher who raped, became pregnant by, and later married her 6th grade student, Vili Fulau. In the 2011 short story, the friend Mary Kay serves as a device, playing not only the supportive friend for the protagonist, but a hint of the villainy of the protagonist. This probably would have been too heavy-handed if repeated on film, and it would have detracted from the Black woman as the major central character, and perhaps maybe even incurred some risk for a small independent film production in invoking her likeness and voice and name. So decentering Letourneau and pulling the story more into a Black cultural context offers a critique of a form of interracial violence that does not get much attention or caring protective response, the grooming and sexual assault of boys and young men. And I'm thinking about this in the context of the masculine storytelling of pop culture figures, such as rappers Lil Wayne, who was a victim, Lil Boosie, who was a perpetrator by hiring sex workers to assault his sons as an initiation into hetero hypermasculinity. Comedians Godfrey and D.L. Hughley, who I have both seen tell stories on Vlad's podcast about being initiated into sex by adult women. So because of the hypermasculization and hypersexualization of Black boys and men, this is often not recognized as violence or as crimes. And this is perhaps exemplified by a scene in the film where Zeke, the gardener, watches the transformed Abby attack Derek and chastises the surviving boy but does not comfort him. So these are conversations that I think cannot and probably should not happen within the Blacks in horror format, where the sole Black character is removed from a cultural context that can only be expressed within the Black collective. I think they must happen within community, and I'm playing with this idea that maybe that's also where you could have Black monsters, like within a Black collective. But I'm still working with that. This is Black horror that critiques violence without re-perpetuating it on screen, because it uses this sort of analogy of the monster so we don't have to see the sexual violence rehearsed. It is Black horror where white people are not the only problem that Black people face. So since the massive success of Jordan Peele's Get Out, I feel like so much of TV and film Black horror tends to be or either get read as analogies to white supremacy to varying degree of effectiveness. I think Black horror ecologies have the potential to give us a greater biodiversity. I'm just running with this metaphor of Black horror texts and like a broader range of what they can speak to and what they can say. Thank you. Thank you. All right, good afternoon, everybody. So let's just get into it. So whether conceived of as real or imaginary, friendly or terrifying, the monster embodies and upends our hopes and fears about religion, the limits of science, the afterlife, and fundamentally what it means to be human. To that end, the figure of the monster has been a cultural and religious obsession for generations. The monster is a figure of difference, and as such, every age has been haunted by and pushed for a reckoning with these figures of difference, these entities that haunt the Western imaginary. The category of the monster and its inability to be contained has disrupted and forced a renegotiation of the human, especially the universalized one, in all its iterations. Though scholars of numerous disciplines contend with the category of the monster, issues of race are usually not emphasized. And so this is where the start of this paper is coming from. I'm hoping to expand it into a larger piece of work that is creating what I call a Black teratology, or kind of Black monster theory. So turning to Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, she has made clear that these Western modes of thinking and engaging cannot help but play in the dark. They have an Africanist presence throughout. And as Morrison argues, the figure of Blackness in American literature and cinema and visual culture plays a decisive role in shaping American culture, central to white identity, fundamentally elaborated through difference. This Blackness elaborated through difference becomes visually realized in the cinematic space through the category of the monster. As such, Morrison's Playing in the Dark can be seen as a highly effective call to arms. That, coupled with Hortense Spiller's urge for Black women to claim monstrosity, might open new paths. Their cause necessitates rereadings, reconfigurations, with endlessly flexible language. My response is an examination of how Blackness disrupts and transcends current engagement with the category of the monstrous. The monstrous, as I conceive of it, is an under-theorized yet generative ideological construction that recognizes how the historical, socio-political origins of the monster contribute to its own categorization. In order to think more carefully of this, I will briefly turn to Nia DaCosta's Candyman 2021 to unearth how the monstrous provides the space to renegotiate, to re-examine, and reconstruct traditional understandings around Black subjectivities and identities. This allows for endless hermeneutic possibilities in the study of Blackness and Black religion. Now, monster studies or monster theory, of course, as we all know, is a burgeoning field of analysis, but unfortunately, its engagement with the interconnections of race, and I'm talking specifically of Blackness, usually gets relegated to issues of negative bodily representation through the lens of the monster figure. Scholars of Black study and Black religion who engage the category of the monster tend to theorize it in two significant ways. The first is a deep dive into the racist and stereotypical origins of the Black monster as part of the justification for the creation of post-slavery subjects. This happens as a logical response to white authors metaphorizing discourses of racial difference in the genre, and politicians then applying the genre's tropes to actual minorities, defining minorities and the marginalized through their activities as monstrosity, rendering them unfit for an equal place in society. Necessarily, Black writers and cultural producers have seized the genre to describe the real horrors of existence within racially oppressive and enslaving societies. The second is a theoretical coherence around two types of monster, the cyborg and the alien. Without a deep engagement of all the possibilities afforded by all the other infinite configurations of the monster, figurations that do not adhere to respectable formulations. Both engagements limit the generativity that might surface when fully engaging Black monsters past the negative or the supra. I argue that the monstrous, as understood over and against the monster and monstrosity, is a generative category for understanding Blackness and Black religion. The discourse of the monster often draws from three different terms: the monster, monstrosity, and the monstrous. These terms are often deployed interchangeably, even though they have distinct usages, meanings, and approaches. They are connected even as they are distinct. In order to speak to this, these three terms form what I call monsterisms, a tripartite composition formed by the slash entities, monster, monstrous, monstrosity. These speak to the relations between these three terms as well as their distinct usages. The monster is about embodiment, physicality, and representation. Monstrosity is about the perception and the cultural effect of the monster's categorization, and the monstrous, which is a result or response to the rendered and at times coded monster characterization, prescribes many multivalent moments, movements, behaviors, and actions that allow for actancy, perpetual becomings, and the ability to elude and manipulate harmful logics. In other words, the monstrous is the space where social and political ideologics of race can be upended and renegotiated. The monsterisms, therefore, speaks to the varied ways that cultures have come to deal with the non-normative. Blackness as a category, and any other marginalized identity positions such as queerness, disability, etc., disrupts the normative framing of the monsterisms by underscoring the importance of the monstrous as a way of moving and engaging with the world. This disruption entails recognizing how the categories of the monster and monstrosity are oversaturated with harmful categorizations, anti-Black logics, and white supremacist ideologies. Over and against these two categories, then, the monstrous becomes a generative conceptual term that allows for the movement in and through the violence of subjugation made possible by the very deeming or rendering of one as monster. The monstrous, therefore, opens up possibilities in and through the violence it names and has been named. This is especially clear in the visual rendering, as you see. The monster is a line of demarcation that remains fixed against what is perceived as normal. Monstrosity mirrors that formation and forms another line of demarcation opposite and yet in proximity. The monstrosity perceives the monster and is reflected in its gaze. Thus, once someone is categorized as a monster, any activity is perceived as a form of monstrosity. However, the monstrous vacillates in multiple directions between the static lines of monster and monstrosity, but offers fluidity, movement, and perpetual becomings that are forced to recognize the rendering that occurs between the monster and monstrosity. The tripartite monsterisms, monster, monstrous, monstrosities, appear in every study and theorization of the monster. Monsterisms across boundaries of medium and category and are visualized and represented in folklore, popular culture, the arts, scientific and medical investigations, and religion. Many theorists, from Foucault to Hegel, Derrida to Bakhtin, Haraway to Warren, Sharp to Hartman, Fanon to Morrison, all have engaged the monster in some iteration as a way to think through the limits of science, humanity's placement in the past, the future, and our understanding of the other. However, as Patricia McCormick notes, no singular taxonomical category is ascribed to the monster. As an entity, it is so ambivalent, so ambiguous, and so culturally situated that it at times appears contradictory and paradoxical in nature. What is clear, the monster and the other monsterisms force a semantic slipperiness that makes them useful, dangerous, and constantly in need of defining. In other words, the monstrous is a category of emergent becoming. Monsterisms speak to instabilities, liminalities, processes, and shifts over time, rejecting universalist and essentializing categories, which means that as a monsterism, the monstrous is also in flux, moving in and shifting in relationship to the logics of subjugation that descend upon it. By seeking out and engaging in a myriad of possibilities, the monstrous invokes and creates through its liminality. It enacts survival strategies. It encourages those who have been rendered as monstrous to cope with the world as is, and or creates new worlds to deal with the one we have currently. This movement, these enactments, speak to a desire to become. They are ways and expressions of refusing and navigating the static and overdetermined categories superimposed upon marginalized communities, particularly Black people. This becoming is another way for Black bodies to seek out more life meaning and to resist their objectified status. In other words, the standard impulse towards Black religion or the quest for complex subjectivity. The monstrous, then, is a fluid process of making meaning, allowing us to think of the intersections of religion and other co-constitutive identity categories, again, such as queerness and disability and gender, race, etc. We all know that some bodies are perpetually monstrified due to the monster's cultural, phenomenological, and political constructions. Monstrosity functions through the imperial gaze as a way to distinguish civilized people from monsters. Monsters as a category were initially created as a means to identify physical differences, phylogenic. However, over time, it is now deeply invested in the political formulation, or sociogenic, as a means to justify the continued governing of peoples, explicitly or implicitly. Monstrosity then has biopolitical mechanics undergirding its construction. Whiteness, through the logics of anti-Blackness, has created a history, a language, and a social function which renders Blackness as perpetually monstrous through its deployment of perceived monstrosity. In other words, colonial imperial history is invested in rendering Blackness and all others deemed inferior as always monstrous, while maintaining that perception throughout time. This rendering is so embedded and so encoded, it does not shift even as culture changes, because Blackness is not simply a monster. They are imbued as political nothing. It's the supreme monster, produced as simultaneously subhuman, superhuman, and suprahuman, a la Zakiya Jackson. This is especially true in the cinematic space, beginning with The Birth of a Nation, to King Kong, and even to the religious artifacts of voodoo, conjure, and the zombie that seemingly pop up in countless horror films in demonic and inadequate ways. Race as monster has been a primary mode undergirding discourses in Gothic and horror literature and film for some time. As Maisha Wester argues, minoritized or racialized bodies configured through monstrosity and rendered as monster become a visage wherein authors and writers can use them as permanent objects of discourse. As stated previously, theorists, critics, and authors of color have bemoaned and critiqued that Blackness is always reduced to monstrosity. However, a number of authors and theorists, such as Ralph Ellison, W.B. Du Bois, Frantz Fanon, and Toni Morrison, have turned to that same Gothic symbolism and the lens of horror as productive for depicting the horrific realities that are produced by those same racial ideology and dynamics. In fact, horror theorists Jack Halberstam and Teresa Gadou have also contended that these texts, and a number of Black films as well, both confirm and interrogate the way Black subjecthood becomes a massive signifier configured through the monster. However, because there is currently an under-theorization of all monsterism as tied to Blackness, specifically the monstrous, Black theorists focus more on whiteness, attempting to create the Black subject through the same signifiers that have rendered Blackness as that monstrous nothing. As writers, producers, and theorists try to reveal the many ways anti-Black logic serve in the process of racial construction, rendering racialized bodies as supreme other monster, what occurs is a highlighting of the countless negative connotations that aid in the rendering process. However, hyper-focusing on the negative images and stereotypes keeps Black monster studies tied to unending forms of terror. In other words, there is a need to show how images have created monstrosity, which has served to produce Blackness in culture as subhuman, monsters, and beasts. The response premise towards deconstruction that most authors engage as they think through malicious entrenchment involves highlighting Black morality, civility, integrity, and beauty as the only corrective. This means the only way to deconstruct or renegotiate the master narratives that have rendered minoritized bodies as monster is dependent on recovering, reclaiming, and reimagining Black history and experiences through a respectable, oftentimes futuristic engagement. However, the monstrous considers this mode while offering another, realizing that we live in a world where anti-Blackness, white supremacist ideologies, and negative monsterizations are pervasive and insidious. Even as culture shifts, Blackness is seen and engaged as a political monster, a form without form. No matter how we purport new images as a means to circumvent the rendering process, it will still be an overdetermining factor in racial construction. The monstrous then becomes the space where all forms of engagement and renegotiation can occur. Because the monstrous is fluid, boundary blurring, meaning making, and at times both respectable and salacious, it is generative. So I'm more interested in the ways that the category of the monstrous allows us to interrogate, renegotiate, and redetermine what it fundamentally means to be human and every other possibility in between, which means an engagement and a consideration of absent or undead bodies, uncategorizable bodies, or those called freaks, fungal bodies, as we learned today, and techno bodies. This opens a site of agency that negotiates a queerly complex relationship to nature, origin, narratives, and language that does not require a positivity and perversity format. The category of monstrous allows for a radical and perpetual making of self, outside and in opposition to the normative structures that render it as monster in the first place. Thus, the monstrous does not valorize the negative and aberrant, however, it also doesn't bemoan it. Instead, it's simply a place where resistance, movement, and response can be made by those deemed other in multivariate ways. The other monsterisms force the monstrous into that liminal space, bracketed by the negative and harmful categorizations, and rendering it as a terroristic through the lens of monstrosity. Yet the ideological structure of the monstrous forces reproductive futurity because it allows those rendered as monstrous the space to continually become whatever it is necessary for them to attain actancy, engagement, and then subversion. Salvatore De Bono states that monstrous subjectivity allows for the bridging between notions of social death and hegemony while refraining from romanticization as oppressed and othered. And while I agree with De Bono that monstrous is a category that serves as a space to resist and subvert, I, again, am not interested in the creation of a new subjectivity. Rather, the speculative opportunities provided by non-realist horror fiction and cinema highlight the means by which those rendered as monstrous can just simply recontextualize their position. As stated earlier, the monster and all forms of monsterisms are concerned and point toward the future, standing at the threshold of becoming. And by becoming, I turn to the conceptualization of becomings as made popular by theorists such as Deleuze and Guattari and Braidiati, who suggest that becoming implies multiplicity, celerity, ubiquity, metamorphosis, and treason, the power of affect. Becoming portends generativity, disruption, and new constitutions of a perspective, aims toward nonlinear epistemologies and the counter-narratives derived from the monstrous. The category of the monstrous allows for an abstracted rendered entity to have an infinite trajectory without finitude. They don't necessarily have to become another thing, but rather they continually emerge in light of ever-shifting categories and knowledges. Accordingly, the monstrous becoming provides conceptual fluidity as the monster takes shapes and reforms considering constant historical, sociopolitical changing parameters. So in what follows, I now turn to DeAnna from Candyman to briefly show what is possible when the monstrous is engaged as a capacious entity, allowing for those same perpetual becomings, creating expansive self-actualization or belief in oneself. Through the monstrous, one is aware of how and why they have become rendered monster. Instead of being overwhelmed by the cycles of terror afforded the categorizations or the physicality pushed on the monster's body, in the space of the monstrous, one exists, navigates, and engages in futurity through any means. So before we turn to the case study, I'll query you all. How do we listen to monsters? How are they believed? Does listening create the opportunity to respond to Hortense Spiller's urging to claim monstrosity by entering into the space of the monstrous? According to Michael Michaud, since monsters are both warning signs and portents, we must continually question what each monster is saying to each individual, community, culture, and society, even when their messaging seems unspeakable. It is up to us how we respond once we've identified the monstrous message. Sometimes the monstrous can create opportunities to simply attest, witness, and believe, and collude with the monster in an effort to open oneself up to otherness, to unsettle, and in a term of so much religious heaviness, prophesy, to create belief. So Nia DaCosta's Candyman 2021 serves as a spiritual sequel to the 1994 film, positioned as the third installment in the series. The story follows Anthony McCoy and his girlfriend, Breonna Cartwright, in Chicago's now gentrified high-rises, which used to be projects Cabrini Green. Seeking inspiration, McCoy explores the Cabrini Green housing projects after hearing a ghost story from Breonna's brother. On his search to understand the story's origin and its geographical position, McCoy encounters William Burke, who introduced him to the urban legend of Candyman, a vengeful spirit summoned by saying his name in a mirror. McCoy becomes utterly obsessed, creating an art piece centered around the legend titled Say My Name. As McCoy delves deeper into legend, he descends into madness, while Breonna grapples with her own trauma and the co-constitutive trauma of her maddening partner. It is revealed that Candyman's origins lie in a history of lynching and racial injustice, perpetuating a cycle of vengeance against those who summon him. Burke manipulates McCoy, intending to resurrect the Candyman hive as a tool of revenge against systemic racism and oppression. He mutilates McCoy, attempting to complete his transformation into Candyman, but Breonna intervenes, killing Burke and ultimately summoning Candyman herself. And so, giving trigger warning, we're going to see some violence here. The movie then resolves with every iteration of the hive, now including McCoy enacting vengeance on the police squadron, brutally massacring them. The original Candyman, Daniel Robitaille, returns and instructs Breonna to tell everyone, ensuring that the legend lives on and creating a moment of religious proselytizing. So before I give analysis, I'm just going to play the clips.
I think he's dead.
And was. Okay.
Can I see myself?
What?
In the mirror. I'll tell you everything if you let me see myself.
No.
I'll say whatever you want. Candyman. Candyman.
What?
Candyman.
What's that?
Candyman.
Candyman?
All right, right, for time, I won't keep playing it. All right, but so I want to say that most people that engage Candyman, right? Brianna, though seemingly ancillary character rendered as simple background fodder, does not get major attribution, but she provides resolution for all the narrative's major players. Though Brianna is not technically perceived as a monster in the way that Candyman is, she engages the monstrous space and shows that people and places can be transformed by the monster and that rendering process. From the initial scene, Brianna is unconcerned and vehemently objects to the urban legend. She even makes light of the summoning spell as she tries to tell McCoy that this story should go no further than the myth. So what about Brianna allowed her to be the witness that perpetuated the myth? Why and how should she be believed as the witness? In other words, why Brianna and not William Burke, who desperately wanted to be the monster, to occupy the space, to tell that sweet, sweet story of Candyman, especially given that Brianna does not trust, care, or believe in the myth. Brianna does not need to meditate on urban legend about unending, unlawful, and undeserved deaths because she is haunted by the memories and trauma of witnessing her own father's suicide. As a tortured artist, her father waits until Brianna is near before taking his life, making her the witness. She has seen actual death and doesn't need to search it out. Thus, Brianna's continual claim, Candyman isn't real, is not unbelief, but rather disbelief. So many in her life want to play games with an urban legend when death was always ever near for her. And for Brianna, death was realistically close as her significant other spirals out in a continued moment of mental instability. Additionally, most of the characters who engage with Candyman are simply looking to be terrorized, to be created by the monster. They summon him, they say his name, they taunt him. They traffic in the spectacle and the spook, and through perception and gaze, the urban legend is continually perpetuated through a refraction of monstrosity. However, because Brianna was included into the monstrous choice that was suicide, she is one of the only characters implicated by the hive that does not search him out. She isn't looking for him, especially not in the same ways that the summoners, Helen Lyle, McCoy, and Burke are. So when Brianna finally does call for him, she finds him in a different capacity, not through spectacle, but by truly witnessing his power. This allows her to harness and operationalize him without ever being possessed by him. Brianna has been tortured, triggered, and traumatized by temperamental artists such as her father and her boyfriend. She was particularly adept at listening to the monster always in proximity to her. And this is why she was continually affected by the death and dead bodies of folks near her but not inclusive of her. Brianna, in her captured state, becomes privy to various formations that render Burke, McCoy, the Candyman, and the Hive as monster. As she tries to save her significant other, Brianna is unwittingly forced into a monstrification circuit and leans into the monstrosity which lay dormant in her life. To save her boyfriend after witnessing his monster rendering process, she becomes monstrous to survive. In this moment, Brianna takes a pen and brutally murders Burke. Now, most will say the murder, simply self-defense. However, there is a nod to that monstrosity because she takes the pen after initially removing Burke as a threat and begins to stab him mercilessly. McCoy comes in after the 22nd stab, and with no sign she was going to stop, says, "I think he's dead." Here, McCoy, possessed and monstrified, actually rendered monster, has to tell Brianna to pull back from her monstrosity because the entity that's threatening the both of them is dead. Brianna chooses as a survival option then to enter that monstrous space to ensure her survival. She chooses this option once more after the police try to entrap her and force her to bear false witness and lie on their behalf. She makes a monstrous decision that is in fact close to suicide to kill the police, even if that meant she would be killed or indefinitely possessed in the process. Brianna makes this conscientious choice, a willful choice, and she does it with a smile. She summons Candyman not as an object of terror and fascination, but rather with full knowledge and revulsion at what his presence would be. Brianna utilizes the monstrous space to enact horror, and Candyman, for the first time in the entirety of the film, can be fully released. All members of the Hive are depicted, and the full force of the Hive is unleashed on all those violent officers. Now, it's important to note that Brianna doesn't just summon a Candyman, she releases the Hive and returns the original Candyman to his intended purpose. He's no longer terrorizing the Black and brown folks subjected to redlining violence, which gives a nod back to Jalondra's work, right? One issue that the original Candyman, that this Candyman resolves is that in the original film, the vengeful spirit isn't enacted toward the violent perpetrators that caused the creation of his malevolent entity. Instead, he kind of terrorizes Black and brown people, and that's because of where they're placed, right? The redlining, gentrification, classism, and a host of other racial logics have rendered the victims of an angry spirit not meant for them, right? So through Brianna's monstrous becoming, the original legend is finally able to convene on the police, the stand-ins and metaphors for the original lynch mob that initially rendered him as a monster in the first place. Therefore, Brianna's ability to listen to the monster allowed her to enact a monstrous provocation instead of a terroristic summoning, wherein she engages in a becoming witness without succumbing to victimhood or possession. So just to conclude, monstrosity shows up throughout literature and theory and cultural productions with an absurd frequency. The characterizations are slippery and at times have unequal meanings attached. The monster is an outside designation that is rendered, created, and produced. However, the insufficiency of language and interpretation surfaces when we believe that the monster rarely speaks for itself. Hopefully, as the case study shows, this is a simple fix. We can listen to these meaning machines and possibly respond with a new hermeneutic that is premised on that slipperiness, the ambiguity, the horror, and the deconstruction of the normative. Western definitions of ontology, subjectivity, and selfhood have always negatively impacted minoritized and othered bodies. The Black body, specifically, is perpetually implicated in that terror matrix of monstrification. However, the monstrous offers ontological disruptions, pointing towards possibility and futurity in the horror moment. As the monstrous is enacted, one can engage Blackness and Black religion as a perpetual process of becoming, replete with fluidity, multiplicity in its practice and in its presentation. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. All right, we've got about 15 minutes left for questions. Do we have a mic manager? All right, any questions to start us off? We've got a gentleman back there. I'll run the mic to you. No?
DeAnna Daniels, I wanted to ask you a question. But first, I'd like to make a comment. I think the triangulation under monsterism is brilliant. It's one of those formulations that allows me to clarify some of my own thinking, and for what it's worth, I'll be citing you in my paper tomorrow. I really do. I think it's brilliant, and it's immediately generating a lot of thinking and a lot of analytic insights for me, so great job. Okay, so the question is about Nia DaCosta's Candyman, and I really think your analysis works. And I want to see if you could triangulate it with a kind of meta-narrative in that film that concerns art. And when I think about the way that art is, the making of art, the marketing of art, the dialogue of art is represented in the film, I think about it in terms of the three sort of major characters who are implicated in Monstrosity. There's Anthony, of course, who's making art, and it's unclear whether he is exploiting monstrosity, I think that's the right term to use, or is succumbing to it, or somewhere in the unstable liminal middle. Okay. There's Brianna, who seems to be exploiting or desiring to exploit Anthony's art or Anthony's body. And then there's Burke, who provides the kind of meta art for the film as a whole, as we see him in that first scene playing with those puppets, which will then represent the entire hive at the end of the film. There might be a fourth figure, which is the intertextual dialogue, which happens both narratively and cinematically with the original Candyman, particularly the way that the buildings are represented. So that question of art and its relationship to your analysis of monsters, monstrosity, and the monstrous. I hope that question is making sense and feels aligned and in tune with what you've said.
Absolutely, and thank you. And so in the larger work, I talk more about this. Only thing I would tweak is I don't think Brianna is exploiting them, right? I think Brianna, like a lot of Black people, are in positions that take on exploitation, but that is not. She can need a check, right? At the end of the day, she's the only one listening to Anthony. And the issue is that what's coming down to it is about authenticity. So people aren't engaging his artwork because they don't think it's authentic, meaning that it's not as aggressive as they want it to be. They keep asking him for more. And when he kind of descends into madness, as he becomes more and more mad, right? He ends up killing an art dealer, right? Spoiler alert. And he's mad at her because she says his art sucks. And he basically says, well, it's easy to make art if you get an artist paycheck and you live in a loft and you get to write these reviews and eat the great food. It's real easy for you to make those comments. But what about us that's living in this and I'm just trying to replicate what I'm experiencing? And then you tell me it's not enough. So what do I do with that? Which is why his piece, which is say your name, you look at it in the mirror, you're supposed to see yourself. And so if you descend into madness after saying the name, it's because you're mad. Right? It's not actually about the monster, it's the monster being reflected. So that's what's happening over and over again. And what Brianna is saying is like, hey, just do your art, do something. Just be happy, right? Don't worry about if the artist likes it. Don't worry if it gets into an art house. Do it because you want to do art and you want to be authentic to you, because she knows that as you keep depending upon these processes that tell you you're good or you're bad or what you're doing is artistic, you could kill yourself and die. And we don't want that. So she's really actually listening to all the iterations of the monster, from the people that are trying to hire her, to her boyfriend, to her brother. She's trying to listen to every person who's not listening to her reflect back to them with the monster that's coming up in them. So I would absolutely say that there is a meta narrative here. And the corrective is, again, because we know that the original Candyman was an artist. Right? He was an artist, and for his art, he fell in love. He was as authentically him as he possibly could be, which is to fall in love with the subject. And he was killed, tortured, and then honey poured on him and bees attacked him, right? So like, because of that, what happens? You almost have to become the monster for someone to believe you. So I've been thinking a lot about belief, and that comes back up again. I hope that helps.
All right, we've got someone right there in the middle. Thank you for that answer, by the way. That was beautiful.
Well, as the young people would say, those presentations were off the chain. But I have two questions for Dr. Davis. One, could you say more about the preacher as siren? I find that such a fascinating ideal, if you don't mind. And then secondly, was something with respect to the ideal of boyhood innocence. And I remember that story of Letourneau. I believe that's
Mary Kay Letourneau, yeah.
And so I remember asking my students about it. And what was clear for a few years is that none of my male students, and I mean none, didn't see it as abuse. Mm-hmm. And so how do we grapple with that? So those are just my two questions.
Yeah, and also one of the things that strikes me when I mention like Godfrey and D.L. Hughley, they also, like, they tell these stories and I'm like horrified, right? Like and they're laughing, you know. They also did not represent though, oh, this was this terrible thing that happened to me. Like, they told it as funny stories, right? I mean, I think it's a coping mechanism, and then I think that people don't always understand like how sexual violence is not always violent in the way that, you know, like someone can entirely think that they're in love and even experience pleasure and still be being abused, right? And might not even realize the ways in which that trauma plays out in their relationships and their sense of themselves and their capacity for intimacy. Like, they might not even understand that. And I think that's a big conversation to have with Black men. Because these celebrity stories are not the only stories I've heard like this. And, you know, so just because a young person, you know, just because young boys don't think that that's a bad thing doesn't mean that it's not an incredibly violent, you know, an incredibly, you know, like a violent abuse, right? And it will have ramifications regardless of how people may believe that they're experiencing it in the moment, right? And the same thing can be true of child sexual abuse. Like, it's a complicated topic, but I don't think we often talk about, like, there's like the power dynamic is where the violence is sometimes. Okay, the preacher, I don't think I said anything about preacher. You mean the siren? She's a teacher. Oh, okay, she's a teacher. Yeah, so like in the short story, when I went back and read the short story, I'm like, okay, it's not like a sea monster, but for some reason I had the impression when I read the short story, and I read the short story before I started this whole mermaid project, or maybe I would feel differently, but when I was reading the short story, I just got the sense of like an animalistic kind of reptilian kind of predator. I was not picturing a mermaid. Like, that's not what, or a siren, right? Some people distinguish between the mermaid is the more, I guess, innocuous version of the siren is like the predator of this hybrid fish woman. So I just thought that was so fascinating. Like, when I started reading horror noir, watching the movie, I thought I was watching the documentary, and then when it came on, I'm like, what is this? And the first story is this like story that I recognize, except she was a siren. And so I just think there's something really fascinating about it. I think some of this was expediency. It's a lot easier to just like do some hair and makeup than try to come up with like a convincing reptile. But how does that choice sort of change the dimensions of the story? And I haven't decided whether I want to bring in some of the African cosmological concept of Mami Wata, but like sometimes Mami Wata shows up as a deity, but sometimes she shows up as an urban legend to warn people from staying away from the water, be careful of beautiful women, like, you know, so, you know, I haven't fully decided what I'm gonna do with that, if I even wanna bring in that connection in that dimension, but yeah, I don't know that it connects to my central argument about Black horror ecologies, but it's just an important difference in the visual text to point out, and just one of the examples of the many kind of little shifts and changes as you move between mediums, and the way that that could shift the like political resonance of the story.
Thank you so much. All right, we've still got a few more minutes. Do we have any other questions? We've got one right there. Thank you so much for running that over.
Hi, thank you. Those were quite breathtaking, actually. I really appreciate it. My question is for Edmund. So I was very intrigued by a model, a cosmology, a worldview whereby the alien can be viewed not as a horrifying invader to be resisted and defeated or succumbed to, but just dealt with and accommodated and merged with even by the end. And I'm wondering, is there a fundamentally different engagement simply with difference writ large that underpins that? I mean, the alien is only alarming in narratives because it is difference from the outside. Well, if difference is a neutral, or dare I even say it, a positive good in the world, then that should in theory be welcomed rather than a source of horror and violence and resistance. So is there this underpinning different view of difference?
Thank you for that, Isa. So one of the categories that I kind of theorize is xenocorporeality, which is this idea of the alien body. And so I'm thinking about the discourse and the kind of semiotic ideas that frame our imagining or representations of the alien. So what are the sociopolitics, of imagining or representing the alien? And so we can go back to 1953 Invaders from Mars, right? And we know that there is a very political subtext. Some might even argue that it's very clear what the political argument is. And so in thinking about xenocorporeality, I am, like I mentioned, I'm situating the imagining of the alien within a distinct kind of cultural framing, right? And so I allude to Harry Garuba's idea of animist materiality or animist consciousness, which essentially is theorizing that, non-human difference, or at least the evidence of a corporeally distinct, kind of figure is not, or does not necessarily legitimize the kind of excitation of dread or fear that we find with, like, Emmerich's aliens in Independence Day. I don't know if, or, the aliens in Ridley Scott's, movies. So we have, what I'm arguing is that, yes, we have beings that are, xenobiologically superior. They have, they look different. But then these non-human bodies, because, and this is why I'm talking about affect theory, right? How do we respond to these non-human creatures? And so Brian Masumi, in Parables for the Virtual, argues that affect is not this kind of affect is a kind of pre-subjective thing. It cannot be interpreted outside of a kind of definitional framework that is a cultural mediation to how we respond to, just any non-human being. And so that is how I'm situating it. I mean, when you gaze upon Ijele, Ijele is threatening, right? It looks threatening, but then because there is a cultural conditioning of how to respond to Ijele or how to respond to Eshu Elegbara, arguing that it takes away that kind of, so yes, the body is uncanny, right? But then it takes the kind of fear and dread that is usually associated with the non-human, right? And also because Nnedi Okorafor is also subverting this idea of the alien as archetypal villain, right? That we find rehearsed in a lot of science fiction texts.
Awesome, thank you. So we only have 2 more minutes. I don't think that's quite enough time for a question. So could we do one more round of applause, please? Thank you all so much. So you can join us all in the hall outside for our little coffee break at 4:45.